Hey guys, Jester here. Today I'm going to be going over a module that has stirred up much discussion and interest throughout the years in the D&D community, specifically the World of Greyhawk community. It is the module WG5 Mordenkainen's Adventure. It originally, it was let's see, what year was it? This year is 1984. That's when this came out. In it, Mordenkainen here went with one of his companions to Mar Castle to investigate some rumors, and ended up having to go back and get a couple of more of their companions to finish the module. But it was such a compelling adventure that years later, 20 to be exact, they came out with more in-depth and added on to this, which we'll be going over here in a minute. It's a hack and slash adventure, and basically you go into this dungeon and you just have at it and get a lot of treasure and whatnot, but it set up what followed, and what followed is what has sparked the mystery and the intrigue and the interest since then. Dungeon Magazine was a magazine that contained all kinds of articles and adventures inside, and this was done in 2004, which was the 30th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, which was created in 1974. Whereas, like I said, all the other dungeon magazines contained articles and different adventures and stuff. This one was completely dedicated to Mar Castle. It's the only adventure in here. It's the only thing other than ads that is in here. It basically took and redid the original, but in a way where it basically picked up where this one ended, and it was supposedly, I believe, 25 years in the future from the module timeline, not real life. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you the from here. It's an article that Gary Gygax wrote back in, I believe, 74. I believe it was 74. We'll find out here in a second. I'll just let Gary's words speak. "30 years ago, in 1974, a humble magazine called War Games Digest was the titan of game-related media. It contained strategy tips and scenarios for historical miniatures wargaming, then the foundation of what would eventually become the lifestyle gaming hobby. In War Games Digest's May issue of that year, a Midwestern miniatures game designer named Gary Gygax penned a brief article to explain a new game published by his company, a game that would, over the next 3 decades, turn the gaming hobby on its ear, create a massive 1980s fad, and redefined fantasy for millions of gamers and readers. With Gary's permission, we've reprinted that article in full to reveal a time in which no one had ever heard of role-playing games, and the foundations of our favorite hobby had only recently come into being. 2004 is the 30th anniversary of the Dungeons and Dragons game, and we present this special issue to commemorate Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson's fantastic invention, and to thank them for creating something that means so much to so many of us. Ever since Tolkien's fantasy books attained popularity, there has been a continuing growth of interest in the subject of swords and sorcery games. Of course, we are all exposed to fantasy as children through the medium of fairy tales, and now as adults we are treated to many of the more mature stories of the genre, such as those being presented by Ballantine Books and in their adult fantasy series edited by Lynn Carter. Somewhere in between the children's works and the often dry and slow so-called adult works, there lies the world of swords and sorcery. Fast-paced, heroic yarns which are filled with brawny swordsmen, magic swords, wicked magicians, monstrous beasts, and beautiful women who must be rescued from them. Pick any of the above for them. The champions of swords and sorcery are Robert E. Howard, Fritz Lieber, L. Sprague de Camp, Fletcher Pratt, and Poul Anderson, to name but a few. All of the activity in the field of fantastic fiction has stimulated considerable interest in fantasy wargaming. For example, consider chainmail. Early in 1969, the evolution of a set of medieval rules began, and when they were published in 1971, a fantasy supplement was included. Despite the fact that the medieval is a reasonably popular period and the rules contained in chainmail are both playable and realistic, about 9 out of 10 purchasers were attracted by the fantasy element. During 3 successive wargaming conventions, there was a great demand for fantastic games, about equal to that for World War II or Napoleonics, while the medieval was generally ignored. Now the most popular periods for miniatures are, in descending order of popularity, World War II armor, Napoleonics, American Civil War, and Ancients, with the medieval following about 5th or 6th. While there is no absolute confirmation at this time, it appears that fantasy wargaming might move into a high place in the popularity ratings. This is indicated by something more than the evidence stated above. There are several large and active groups of wargame enthusiasts in the Twin Cities area. Dave Arneson, a true fantasy buff, worked up a campaign from the chainmail fantasy rules with considerable expansions in many areas. The battle reports were so interesting and humorous that there was no stopping a handful of Lake Geneva players from horning into things. In a few weeks, the rules Dave had done were subjected to even more expansion and change. The result was an entirely new body of rules, now entitled Dungeons and Dragons and being marketed by Tactical Studies Rules, TSR. The most noteworthy thing, however, is the attraction evidenced by the fantasy campaign thus generated. The Twin Cities affair has been running continuously for 3 years, while the game handled by this writer, with Rob Kuntz as co-referee, is entering its 2nd year. Longevity indeed for wargame campaigns. Equally as important, the number of participants has steadily grown. The semi-weekly meetings for the campaign in Lake Geneva have seen an increase from an original half-dozen to as many as 16 eager players, crowded close to hear the moderation by the referees and loving almost every second of it. Those who can be only occasional visitors have all expressed a desire to begin their own local campaigns. What makes Swords and Sorcery wargame campaigns so enthralling? Nothing if you're not of such a bent, but nearly everything if you are at all interested in swords and sorcery. Players select a character type to begin the campaign, either a fighter, magic user, or cleric, whether human, elf, dwarf, or what have you, and naturally they can also opt to play as monsters instead. Each class has disadvantages to balance its advantages. Thereafter, each adventure which the player survives adds to his experience, increasing his abilities proportionally. Adventures are of 2 kinds: underworld expeditions to the labyrinthine dungeons, or perilous treks in the wilderness. The former kind of game is typically the most varied, for it is played on a series of maze maps designed by the campaign referee, each map representing a successively lower level of passages and rooms deep beneath some weird castle. Fearsome beasts lurk within these dungeons, and the players seek to find them and best them in mortal combat, for most guard some item of treasure or magic. However, the way is strewn with pits, traps, and blind corridors, while secret doors, shifting walls, and other tricks serve to confuse and confound the intrepid explorers. Rather than try to even briefly describe the large numbers of monsters, tricks, and traps used, or even a fair sampling of them, a brief dramatic account of one of the more memorable dungeon expeditions is in order. And he goes on to read this encounter that he and his group did. The pair of darkly cloaked wizards had already descended to the 4th level of the dungeons. They were Mordenkainen, a 13th level magic user, and his one-time apprentice, Bigby, himself now a wizard of the 11th level. Together they made a near undefeatable combination, or so they thought. In an earlier expedition, some dozen levels down, they had come upon a key and a few lines of verse. Returning to their chambers, the pair had huddled over tomes bound in dragonhide, consulted ancient parchment scrolls and even older clay tablets, and drawn liquors from bubbling alembics in order to complete some arcane divination as to the key's use. Eventually they achieved some degree of success, for they managed to translate the verse and identify the general area in which lay the gate which the key would open. Proceeding by a twisty route north and east, they now approached a widening of the passage. The crash of massive iron bars behind surprised neither, for this place was familiar territory. Likewise, the sepulchral voice which now spoke was expected. "Choose from the 4 chests before you," it commanded. The wizards opened the first coffer, and as its lid was raised, a 5-headed hydra appeared. But before it could strike, one of the pair made a swift pass with his staff, and the creature wavered and became a tiny snail. Without pause, the other slipped the newly made slug into his wallet, and the opening of the remaining receptacles continued. Finally, the voice which had originally spoken once again sounded, for they had lifted the lid of the charmed case. "You are granted 1 wish of limited power," intoned the bodiless speaker. "We wish to find the door which this key will unlock. Pass through the iron portals and go north. You will find beyond the gates of the great hall." The room in which they stood extended far to the east, and both knew that its far boundary was broken by 2 tall doors of iron. Hurrying thence, they forced open these doors. The way was cunningly barred by numerous hidden entrances and false passages, but perseverance eventually brought them before the huge portals of the great hall. Mordenkainen duly inserted the oddly shaped key, and the gates creaked open. Proceeding yet eastward, the pair soon came to a vast open space, and they knew for the first part of the adventure was over, for they stood on the threshold of the great hall. With cautious steps, the wizards paced ahead, hundreds of feet past a splashing fountain of alabaster, until a thick tapestry curtain barred the path. Parting the hanging, Mordenkainen and Bigby peered into yet another cavernous space, with massive pillars of ivory ranked right and left. These wondrous items they examined immediately, and by levitating to the top it was learned that each column was a titanic pedestal, some 10 feet in diameter, 50 feet high, and each hewn from a single piece of ivory. Pressing yet further into the hall, they encountered a dais, and upon ascending its steps, still another marvel greeted them. There, seated upon granite thrones, were 3 iron statues. Those to either hand appeared to be likenesses of kings, one holding forth a broadsword, while the other presented a dagger. It was the central figure which was most commanding, however, for it was gigantic. The features of its face were vaguely human, expressionless, with a gaping circle of a mouth. As the startled wizards watched, it stirred to life, arising from its seat with a hollow grinding, and advanced toward them. The pair retired slowly at first, but as the iron golem began to move swiftly toward them, both Mordenkainen and his fellow took to their heels. The metal monster gained, so in desperation they sought refuge atop one of the ivory pillars. The golem hurled its bulk against the base of their retreat, and the column shook. Mordenkainen leaned perilously over the edge and began the incantation that would turn the stone beneath the monster's feet into viscid mud, sufficient to entrap and possibly even to totally destroy the ghastly thing, he supposed. The incantation reached its climax, and the paves beneath the iron monster's feet shimmered and turned glutinous, but the golem floated above the mud and in another moment struck the pillar another blow. It cracked. In desperation, the wizards brought forth the brass urn which contained an enslaved Efreet, commanding it to do battle. When the ebon servant sallied forth, however, the golem belched out a sheet of flame from its maw, and the Efreet withered under the blast. There was but one gamble to try. The two wizards descended to fight the creature themselves. At their approach it hesitated, and then shot forth fire once more, but this did but small damage due to their prowess and talismans. While his companion recovered the wounded Efreet, Mordenkainen attacked the golem. The blow from his staff seemed to cause the thing no harm, and its return slash with an evilly discolored sword was barely avoided. Several similar exchanges took place, but then, as Bigby completed his task and turned to join the fray, he saw the monster's metal whip lash out and strike Mordenkainen full in the body. Instantly the wizard was turned to stone. There was nothing more to be done now, the astonished magic user realized instantly, and fled. When sufficient space was gained, for the golem gave up pursuit when the tapestry was passed, Bigby teleported to the stronghold of his associates and related what had happened. Within a few hours he was back once more before the gates of the great hall, and with him were two fighters of exceptional ability, the doughty lords Rag and Felnerith, as well as a cleric, the bishop Ronolf. The party approached the mighty curtain with caution, but when it was parted the scene was quiet, and they continued to advance. Nearby was the calcified Mordenkainen, and all paused while his fellow performed the ritual which would restore his flesh. The spell did its work, but the wizard was far too shaken to be of any help in the ordeal that lay ahead, so he awaited the confrontation well to the rear. Bigby, guiding the four, crept up the steps and beheld the three thrones. As their feet touched the last step, the iron golem stirred as before. Rag and Felnerith leapt into action. In a few quick bounds they reached the other two statues, and as one wrenched for the sword, the other tore out the dagger from the iron hands which presented it. Here, likely, were the very weapons with which to defeat the golem. They turned to see their foe already in action, and as its whip flailed, the stricken Bigby met the fate of his fellow and became stone. The two fighters smote the golem simultaneously, both with telling strokes. It faltered, and the arm that held the lash fell from it with a resounding clangor. Yet it managed to retaliate, and its sword fell full upon Rag. The lord gasped, his visage mottled green, and died. Felnerith, now fighting alone, struck again and again at the iron monster, somehow managing to fend off the golem's strokes, and with a desperate blow finally brought the huge thing crashing to the floor in pieces. The battle was over, but what had been its purpose? The survivors began to investigate. A thorough examination of the area revealed the two remaining statues to be hollow repositories of a fortune in precious stones. Better still, there were tiny coral miniatures of the Great Hall, and from these relief maps it was easy to plan for another expedition at a future date. Now, however, it was time to gather the treasure and bring the body of Rag back into the clean air and daylight of the surface in order to entreat the patriarch of Greyhawk to restore his life, regardless of the cost. And also there was Bigby, whose stony members had to be returned to flesh once again. The three adventurers turned to these tasks. Fantastic? Most assuredly, and perhaps a bit on the corny side also. Nonetheless, it is one whale of a lot of fun. I can vouch for it, for in the adventure related above I was playing rather than judging. To my knowledge, the only fantasy campaign rules currently available are the Dungeons & Dragons set. During their development and final testing, they brought hundreds of hours of enjoyment to all concerned, and we look forward to much more of the same. As a final word, it is necessary to point out that the referee or referees must put in a lot of work preparing for a campaign, but again, I can tell you that it is well worth the trouble. Give it a go. And that is the words of the immortal Gary Gygax. And then the original writer continues. And there you have it. Not even the fertile imagination of Gary Gygax could have pictured the cultural impact D&D would have over the next 30 years. What will the next 30 years hold? We could have positioned this anniversary issue as a look forward to the future of Dungeons & Dragons. Instead, we've decided to travel back to the game's earliest roots and present an adventure intimately tied to the birth of the D&D game. So intimately, in fact, that it's the very dungeon described by Gary Gygax in the preceding article. Buckle on your sword belts and study your most powerful librams. Dungeon readers, it's time to follow in the hallowed footsteps of Bigby and Mordenkainen. Mark Hassel awaits. And so, like I said, this picks up 25 years later in the actual timeline, and your players meet some very interesting things. It takes the original map, adds another level to it, and leaves all kinds of clues for further adventuring. Now this was Dungeon Magazine 112. Then in Dungeon Magazine 124, yet another level was added. And then, finally, in Dungeon 139, another level was added. You can also go online and find, I believe, let's see, where was it? It was another level that, where was it at? I don't remember off the top of my head where it was at. But there was even another level added. And through all of these levels, much mystery was given and created to where you can go online to Cannon Fire and pull up old blogs and just comment after comment and discussion after discussion of trying to unravel all of the mysteries that were given and created through these dungeons, or through these dungeon levels. The entire dungeon never got finished, which is a shame because it was and still is a fantastic dungeon. Don't know if there's really anything else I want to say about it. But I would suggest you go to, like I said, the Cannon Fire website and look up Mark Hassel. And you will find a wealth of information there. You won't understand any of it if you haven't picked up these magazines and read through the dungeon levels therein. But in any case, if you do, make sure you go there to the Cannon Fire website and look up all of the blogs, because you're going to want and need that. It's almost an addiction once you go through this. It's something that you revisit time after time, and it's always in the back of your mind. It's that kind of an addiction. So very cool, though, I will say that. But yeah, all started back in '84 with this one simple dungeon, and years later it it continues. So, hope you guys enjoyed this edition of Storytime with Jester. And as always, hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell. And make sure you share with all your friends. Leave comments in the comments section, because I do love those and will respond as quickly as possible. Also, I don't have a tip jar or a Patreon account, but if you want to support this channel, you can purchase my fantasy fiction novel, Book of Prophecies. You can either go to the About section on this channel or the About section on my Facebook page, and both of those have links to where you can purchase the hardback, the paperback, or the ebook formats. Or you can contact me directly, and I will tell you how to purchase directly from me through PayPal. And you'll get that book a lot quicker than if you go through my distributor here. So anyway, hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time. And until then, and as always, see you soon.